Welcome back to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. On today's episode, my conversation with Gabriele Nicolet. Gabriele is a speech-language pathologist. She's also the host of the Complicated Kids podcast. In her work as a speech-language pathologist and as a parenting coach, she works with parents and children to help them overcome a wide variety of linguistic, speech, and developmental delays. Gabriele's journey to becoming a speech-language pathologist was a winding one. It begins with her studying French, and then at some point she had an aha moment that sent her on her way to her future career. In this conversation, we cover many critical topics to public health, including the role of nutrition and the microbiome in neurological development and speech and linguistic delays. Please enjoy my conversation with Gabriele Nicolet. Gabriele, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Marian. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm very excited to have you, and in the true spirit of the kind of winding path narrative that I love so much, I want to kick off by saying that we met because I got into a car crash. Now, it wasn't like you hit me,
Right.
but the series of events that occurred post-car crash directly led me to you. So I got hit by a car, and then one practitioner referred me to another practitioner, and then that practitioner knows you, and she said, you two should meet.
Yeah.
And the rest is history.
It is. I saw that person this morning. She said, I hooked you up together because I knew you were going to be a match made in heaven. So,
And she knew. She
Here
was
we
so
are.
right.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kick off with that because I think that in this world, in this life, it's important to kind of acknowledge the many ways in which a series of events can lead you to a wonderful happenstance, even if it seems like a car crash, pretty bad at the beginning. And here we are, enjoying the benefits of that random series of events. So welcome. I am thrilled to speak with you and to elevate the incredible work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's begin. Speaking again of the winding path, I want to hear about where your journey begins, what you thought you wanted to be when you grew up, and how winding around and following your curiosity led you to where you are today.
Yeah. So, we'll go all the way back when I was a German-speaking toddler because my mother is German by birth. And so I'm the oldest of three. She spoke German to me. And then, of course, I went to school and my brothers never did. But I think that early experience of bilingualism then set me up for pursuing languages in high school, pursuing, and if I, rear view mirror sort of 2020, if I'm looking back, it's all about communication, and that will be sort of evident moving forward here too. But so I took Spanish in high school. I took French in high school. I studied abroad in France. I decided to go to Georgetown University to their then School of Languages and Linguistics to study French. Not with any like employment purpose in mind, because what do you do with a degree in French? But because it was interesting to me and I really liked it. And if you're asking like in hindsight, what was it that I liked about it? It was being able to communicate with people who are different, coming from a different place than I am. Understanding like what are the rules of culture here? How do we do things? And that's just super interesting. So graduated with a degree in French, went to work at a nonprofit, which I hated because desk work is not my thing.
But all the cute outfits.
Yeah, the cute outfits came later. So quit that first job, traveled a bunch with my now husband, then came back and got cute outfits.
Understood.
At the International Monetary Fund. So stayed there, but also hated desk work. So started kind of looking around and inquiring, like, what is it that I want to be when I grow up? Because I really had no idea. And I ended up being a shadow to a 4-year-old with autism who was going to be, he had received a diagnosis. And at that time, this was the late 90s, usually what happened, if you got a diagnosis of autism, you would go to a special preschool or you would not be able to remain in your preschool. Well, this preschool decided to keep this kid with a shadow. So that was me. I went to all of his appointments with him, and I went to the speech therapy appointment. I'll never forget this feeling. I went to the speech therapy appointment and I watched her do her thing, and I was like, oh, like everything kind of vroom, clicked into place. And I applied to grad school, was accepted, and began attending in the fall of 1998. And then that became its own process, and that was a 3-year master's, because it turns out speech language pathology is something you need to know something about before you do a master's in it.
Turns out.
Turns out. And so that's kind of where I, decided to become a speech therapist, and how I did that. And then I started work at the Ivy Mount School. And so from there, it actually was pretty clear for about 15 years that this is what I was doing. It was super obvious to me. I was very secure and happy in that role. And then I had a couple kids and opened a private practice. And then, I don't know, mid 2010s, I don't know, 2016, 2017, I was like, what else?
Mm-hmm.
And during the pandemic, then went and got a parent coaching certification, which has really, studying coaching has really been an eye-opener and wonderful. And I have been the recipient of a lot of coaching, and I'm the giver of a lot of coaching. And so these days, I kind of think of myself more as a child development specialist, more so than just a speech therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't tend to stay in my lane very well.
I don't know anything about that.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
weird. You're strange.
I'm so weird.
I do want to quickly reflect back a couple of things that you said, because on this podcast, I focus on public health topics, but I do choose those topics, and I define public health pretty broadly. And one of my previous episodes was with a Russian language teacher. And we talked about how I believe that language learning is a critical public health topic, because we can't really understand other cultures fully until we inhabit their lens. And that lens is often linguistic. And in my own journey studying Russian, I learned so much about Russian culture, because when you study the language, you get into the culture. You really can't separate them. You could try, but it would be very difficult. And I think that we do know as a society that, broadly speaking, building tolerance of different cultures is good for public health and safety and security, and just creating a stable and thriving society. But learning a language is a big part of that. So I love how you said that all of this journey for you has partially been about wanting to communicate with people who are different than you, because that's so important.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very beautiful. And I love that that played an important role in how you got to where you are now. I also really love how you were talking about having this moment where you watched the speech language pathologist and it just clicked. Because here you are, you're in your 20s, you've done school, you loved what you were learning about, you've traveled, you've done this, you've done that, and you didn't think I think I want to be a speech language pathologist. You felt it. You had a boom, a moment. And I don't know if everyone is lucky enough to have that sort of experience where they're really put in a setting to see an example of a career. But I think it's important, because we do a lot of asking kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they're like, well, I've read, Busy Town by Richard Scarry. So it's either truck driver, trash man, policeman, baker, candlestick maker. And we don't immerse them in these environments and give them these opportunities to have aha moments. So I want to just spotlight that for a second, because you and I both have graduating seniors who are going off into the world, and they're 18, and gosh darn it, they should know what they want to be when they grow up.
No.
And they do not, and that is okay.
Yeah.
And they need to be exposed to different options so that they can hopefully one day have their own lightning bolt moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, listen, the fact that I was able to just that I had parents who said, sure, you're interested in French, go study French.
Right.
Not, what will you do with that degree? And again, I get not everybody is in that circumstance necessarily, but we all have times when we can explore.
Right.
and really go with your gut, right?
Right. Exactly.
And see what's interesting.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was fun and lucky.
Yeah. So for those who, frankly, like myself, don't know that much
Mm.
about speech language therapy and that sort of process,
hmm
can you tell us a bit more about that? And when you're working as a speech language pathologist with a child, what are the basics? What is someone getting when they come for that kind of therapy?
Yeah. So, um, my practice is focused on birth to 5. So we can talk a little bit about what might happen later. Most people think of speech and language therapy as I have trouble saying my F's
Mm-hmm.
or my A's,
Mm-hmm.
right? I talk like I'm from Boston or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Pakistan, have it yet. And there's so much more to it. So yes, we deal with that, with what's called articulation. So that is, how is your mouth moving in order to say the sounds in words that you need to say?
Mm-hmm.
And there are developmental norms for that we study and put into practice. And there's lots of tricks and tips that, speech therapists know how to use. I'm a big fan of some lollipops lately, for some tongue work and that kind of thing. But really, when we're talking about speech and language, the language part is like enormous because
Mm-hmm.
the language is what's happening in our brains, right? So, how do I know? And this is where we can geek out for like a long time. How do I know that this thing in front of me is a glass? It's a random assortment of sounds
Right.
that we ascribe, but also it's a concept.
Right.
Right? A glass is something we pour water into or liquid into and
Mm-hmm.
drink from it. I know how to hold it. I know roughly what shape it is. If it were a little wider, it would be a bowl. How is it that my brain knows all of that?
Right.
That's like, and very smart people study that. So there's this notion of like, what do we understand? What words do we understand? What words can we say? What do we know about the world? And do we have a match between what we know about the world and what we can say? Then you can get into really interesting problems of like, well, I know exactly what this thing is, but I cannot recall the word glass. So
Mm.
either I cannot imagine the sounds in those words, and the word form's not coming to me, or I cannot motorically produce the sounds
Mm.
in that word. So anyway, there's lots of spaces in the chain where things can break down. And so speech pathology, speech language pathology is the science and art of kind of teasing out what those mechanisms are and then treating them. Now, here's the kicker. We are using almost exclusively behavioral means, and I hope we're going to have time to talk about this.
Yeah.
Behavioral means to treat a neurological issue.
Right.
And so that's where increasingly it gets really wonky for me, particularly with all of the neuroscience that's coming out about how the brain works. For a long time, we didn't know. And so we had to use behavioral data.
Right.
Now we have fMRI, we have, sort of all kinds of imaging that we can do to see what's actually happening in the brain. And so but it's an interesting problem to have this external view, but really be tinkering with internal mechanisms.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I joke a lot that studying Russian taught me English because I was just a native English speaker who's always been very fluent and has never thought about grammar or parts of speech, why I use the words that I use, what they mean. I didn't do linguistics really. I just spoke English confidently my whole life, no problem. You study a language like Russian and you're thinking about case and grammar is hugely important. And even like word order in a sentence is very different depending on the sentence. And so studying Russian gave me this totally different view of English. But I think a lot about language acquisition and associative thinking. And I'm a very associative thinker, big dot connector. And I noticed that the way that language is taught often doesn't work for me because I begin to associate Russian words with just my phone because that's where I study them. So when I see them out in the world, I'm like, huh? I totally know what they
Wow.
mean when I'm on my phone because my brain has made
Oh.
this association. Oh, we're on our phone. We're doing Russian. But out in other contexts, I'm like, wait, what is that? I have no idea what that's talking about. And so I know for myself, I need to like push myself to learn Russian in different contexts. But I'm thinking about what you're saying about like a little kid going, okay, this is a glass. It's an object that holds water. If it were bigger, it would be a bowl. All these different nuanced details that lead us to get to the point where this thing in front of me is a glass.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about how associative that is,
Mm-hmm.
and how if one part of that doesn't get connected, you could, of course, lose it. Because if you look at this and you go, it could be either a glass or a bowl, but I forget, does skinny mean glass and wide mean bowl, or is it the opposite? Like, you could see that easily becoming a problem if something about the way that your brain is associating breaks down.
The other thing that happens, particularly in autism, is that this is a glass, but a different shape, a different color,
Right.
a different vessel has to often be learned as also being a glass. So this is a little bit your problem with Russian, which is I know it on my phone, but I don't know it in the world. This is, right, I know this glass, but not the other glass.
Right.
Dogs, same thing, right? And this is true of like little kids.
Yeah.
Sometimes will ascribe, whatever, dogness to their own pet, but not other pets.
Right.
In typical language development, and again, one of the things I say on my podcast, which you're going to come on, is we don't realize how complicated these neural networks are until something's going wrong. So we actually do expect very young children to look at a Doberman and a poodle and understand that those are the same.
Yeah.
How is that what?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And yet there is this quality of dogness that we intuitively understand. Well, guess what? A person on the autism spectrum sometimes has trouble making that connection.
Right.
And they have to learn Doberman is a kind of dog, poodle's a kind of dog, golden retriever is a kind of dog, and they must learn that explicitly sometimes.
That is so interesting. But it makes total sense when you say it that way. I had never thought about that, the sort of dogness, but that really, it speaks to, again, how I learned language and just never thought about it. Of course it makes sense to me that all of those things are dogs. Like, duh, obviously, but no one ever explained or asked me to explain what makes them a dog.
Yeah.
What is the dogness? Could I really break it down for you? I mean, they both say woof woof, Like what is that essential thing? And there's a lot of like coding in society where we just expect that everyone just gets it. You just get it. You just understand that there's an essential dogness and you never have to define it.
Yeah.
Man.
And this is like what I do all day long. Is like think about like, okay, what are literally this is sometimes something that I work on with kids who are having word finding issues or who are having trouble learning vocabulary. It's like, okay, what are the 3 essential elements of dogness?
Right.
Right? Says woof woof, has a tail that wags and has 4 legs. How is that different or the same as a chicken?
Right.
Right? Because then we got to build the category of animals too.
Right.
So like this is stuff I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about.
Well, and another thing, I'm going to use a personal example, and I would love to hear you geek out on this. So when kids are learning language, just spoken, they can't read yet, among their family, they're obviously learning it the way their family speaks. And I try to be a little bit disciplined on this podcast, but I am a fast talker. I can get unhinged and speak very quickly. And the words kind of slip together. So when my youngest, Frida, was a baby, I was making her these smoothie ice pops. And they're very small. They're little these balls on sticks, and we still have them. And because they're so small and you can eat through them very quickly, I would say to her, do you want 1 for each hand? 1 for each hand. She understood that 1 for each hand meant she got 2 ice pops. But she had no idea that I was saying 1 for each hand. So we developed a slang in our family, which is 1 for chain. She would come up to me and go, 1 for chain? And 1 for chain was what she thought I was saying. She heard 1 for each hand as 1 for chain. And so she said, 1 for chain? And in response to that, I gave her 2 ice pops. Now, she is now 6 and can read and is extremely fluent and very brilliant. But she still says to me, 1 for chain? It is a meme in our family. It's a meme about language acquisition.
Totally.
And I'm
It's
curious
awesome.
how that comes up for children 0 to 5 who are maybe struggling with the basics of language when what they're hearing is they're not sure where the lines are. Like you and I are speaking, we know where one word ends and the next begins. But if I'm learning English as a second language, if I speak quickly enough, I'm not sure where that word ended and where that began. And then we end up with 1-4 chain.
Yeah.
And luckily, she had a mom who was willing to then speak her language back to her.
Yep.
I got what she was saying. But does that come up where
Yeah.
children don't know where words end and they begin?
Yeah, and I think the way I see it most is in very early, very late talking.
Mm.
So early childhood, late talkers. So anybody under the age of like 2.5 who's not yet speaking, I think that there is, and again, I don't have any way of proving this other than my own observations over time, is they can't grab on to where the words end and begin because people are just talking,
Mhm.
because we don't think about this, because, and again, this is where it gets complicated, right? How amazing that a baby could listen to an adult speak and understand that there are units in there,
Right.
right? Like 1-4 chain is a great example of how that didn't happen,
Right.
right? And yet the vast majority of the time it does. So
Right.
like how incredible. Okay, but back to these late talkers, I really do think when kids are having trouble kind of grabbing on to language, one of the first things I say to parents is we got to like use fewer words.
Right.
We have to use one word for the thing that the kid is looking at. What is the one word that is for this activity, right? So, and sometimes maybe it's two, right? So lots of routines come up at this age. So
Right. Like drink water.
exactly.
Get dressed.
Exactly.
But not like, so what do you want to wear today? Pink, blue, red, yellow shirt, pants. And the kid's like, get dressed.
Yeah. And they do kind of, and you just did it in the camera, you know, in the with your body is like
Right.
they get kind of deer in headlights.
Right.
We know that when we have a deer in headlights response, which is like a freeze response, essentially, right? That's a nervous system stress response.
Right.
We are no longer learning.
Right.
So if that's happening a lot and you're trying to learn language, like language capital L, never mind which language,
Right.
and you're out of learning mode, then you're not talking.
Right.
We're not learning because we're too stressed. Because we're like, oh God, some people are talking at me and I have no idea what's going on.
Isn't it funny when things just make sense? Like they're complicated and you don't think about it that way, but it really, really makes sense. I have one more linguistic question for you, which I don't even know if it's in your scope, but I'm going to ask because I'm curious.
And you know, I'll tell you because I don't stay in my lane. So. Go ahead.
Give me an answer.
Yeah.
So, regional dialects.
Mm.
I'm curious about how they evolve.
Mm.
And I feel like they're obviously some kind of social coding. It's like a way to say, I belong. My oldest daughter was not raised in Maryland. We moved here when she was 8. But she has developed and embraced that Maryland O. She was on the podcast and she almost sounded like she was from Texas. This like O she was doing. And I don't think that she's intentionally doing it, but I think that it was an intentional decision to adopt it as a way to fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious, like adding to this complexity of I'm a little kid, I'm learning language, maybe I have autism or some sort of neurodivergence. So it's not just a effortless, natural thing to assume all these linguistic rules that no one ever talks about.
Mm-hmm.
How do regional dialects play into that? Like, is there also another layer where children are trying to figure out how to code to their community, whether that's their family or their school? And in a community like this, you know, we live in the Washington, D.C. area. It's very multilingual, very diverse. It might not always be clear what code you're supposed to be coding with.
Yes, I'm sure that there's really good research on this that I don't have access to, and I don't actually know. But here's what I think is going on. I think you're right. There is, in early childhood in particular, there is a consistent need for protection, nurturing, right? They are defenseless without us.
Right.
So, yeah, brain is going to employ all means to make sure that needs are met. And I do think that part of that is linguistic. I also think that, so for your daughter, for example, the social hierarchy would demand that she fit in.
Right.
And so one of the ways we do that is with our dress, our movements, and our speech, for sure. I mean, code switching,
right,
is a big deal. And it's a really interesting sort of topic to explore. Like, who's code switching? Why are they code switching? Can you choose to code
right. How
switch?
conscious is it?
How conscious is it?
Yeah.
When we get into autism, for example, code switching very quickly becomes masking, right? So I'm hiding because I don't feel safe. But in early childhood, they really aren't safe and they need their people. Okay, so I think there's that. But I also think there's like an exposure thing. So I'll give you a funny story. My son, who is bilingual, both my kids are bilingual. We had a Spanish-speaking nanny, and she was there 3 days a week, and I was working, and 2 days a week I was home. And one day he says to me, "Mommy, I want you to sing Old MacDonald." And I was like, "Old MacDonald? I don't know if I know that song."
1-4 chain?
1-4 chain. And so, because he had been exposed to the nanny saying that the name of the Old MacDonald Had a Farm song, he thought that was how he should pronounce that song. Now,
of course,
once I put myself back together, I was like, "Oh, you want me to sing Old MacDonald? Okay." He never did that again.
Right?
And why? Because he was a typical language learner. He progressed very effortlessly through. I'll tell you another story about him in a second. And so he just immediately was like, "Oh, it's Old MacDonald with my nanny, and it's Old MacDonald with my mom. Done. We're done.
Easy. Yeah, for him.
Okay. If you had asked my son, so round about like age 3 or 4, bilingual kids start realizing that the two languages are separate. This is another thing where, like, if everything's going well, you're like, "Oh, wow, no, this is just normal." But if you had asked my 2-year-old son, what's another way to say apple? He would have looked at you like you had 10 heads. But if you had said, "What is, qué es eso?" and you had asked him in Spanish, he would have been like, "That's a manzana." Of course. Duh.
Right.
But he didn't have any meta-linguistic awareness, right? He could not think about language.
Right. It wasn't a different way. It was just part of the ways.
Exactly.
That is so interesting.
Yeah.
I really think we could spend 100 hours talking just about linguistics because it is too interesting. And I'm a big fan of the work of John McWhorter. I don't know if you read his books at all.
No.
Oh, my God.
Yay.
I won't get too excited about it, but he's a linguist, and his work has opened my eyes to the many different ways that language changes your view of the world because how you say things impacts how you experience things, impacts who you are and how you live. And he does a lot on code switching and growing up in different language households, etc. So huge fan, highly recommend. Writes a column for the New York Times, also has many books.
Fantastic.
But I want to shift, still on the topic of speech, but speaking of like things that people don't connect necessarily, you and I offline have had a conversation about the mouth, the palate, eating, chewing, and how all of this is also connected to speech.
Yeah.
And I think that this is something that people really don't connect. If you have a picky eater, let's say, you're not necessarily seeing that as related to potentially speech delays or any kind of vocal or language issue. And if you have a kid whose palate is really narrow, you're not necessarily worried about how that's impacting their eating or their speech. So I'd be curious to hear both your lived experience, seeing this happen and how it's come up in your own life, but also like if you have any literature type references, like what's being said about this? Where is this research and this kind of dot connecting going in the field?
Okay, well, strap on because we're going down a rabbit hole.
Let's go. I'm ready. I got the parachute.
So in the dental world and the speech language pathology world, this field of study is called myofunctional disorders. So it is the study of, and in fact, oromyofunctional disorders. So the muscles of the face and the mouth, and how they impact growth and development, feeding, speech, life, sleep, breathing, behavior.
A couple things.
Just like a very small thing.
Minor things.
Minor things. And so basically the TLDR is mouths are getting smaller, which means that airways are getting smaller, which means that teeth are getting crowded, and kids aren't sleeping as well as they should, which means they're not acting as well as they should, which means they're not eating as well as they should, because when you feel like crap, you don't want to eat.
We've all
necessarily.
craved sugar when we're exhausted.
Exactly. And that perpetuates itself, and you can talk about that some other time, or maybe we'll do it today. And then also there are speech issues that can arise from that. So anybody who's got any kind of lisp, for example, so that frontal lisp that I was telling you about, or you have some kids who have a lateral lisp, and it sounds, when they say an S, it sounds more like an SH. So it's I shaw a dog on the street, on the street. It comes from the tongue not being anchored in the palate, which is where it's supposed to be. So if you're listening to this and you're like, what is she talking about? Basically, your palate is supposed to be wide enough to house your tongue. That is where it's supposed to live at rest. We are meant to be mouth closed, breathing through our noses, tongue resting up in the palate. That's like ideal physiology. And there's research now to kind of outline why that is and what happens. Breathing is not just breathing. Nasal breathing is best. And so if you want to read about breathing, you should read the book Breath by James Nestor, popular press, easy digestion. It's really good. That's one part of it. And I think the piece I could really like get on my soapbox about, and this has always been true about sleep for me, is when we're not breathing well, we're not sleeping well. So if you've ever had a cold, you know this already. When you breathe through your mouth, you don't rest well. Well, here we are. We've got 2 and 3-year-olds, 6-month-olds even sometimes, who are not breathing well. They don't know any better. So they just wake up grumpy.
Right.
And then as parents, maybe we're not aware that they're not sleeping well. They have the dark circles under their eyes. They're not behaving well. They're not eating well. And we're just like, fix my kid's behavior.
Right.
We want to fix their breathing because we want to fix their sleep. And so that becomes like a whole thing. And listen, the other piece of this is like human behavior. So I referred a 4-year-old. A 4-year-old came to me. I'll like make this concrete. A 4-year-old came to me with multiple speech distortions. It was very hard to understand what he was saying. He couldn't say his L's, his R's, his S's. He was like a spider would be a piter.
Yeah.
Right. So like multiple kinds of speechy things happening. He was also in a state of stress the vast majority of the time. He would not answer questions. He was very kind of deer in headlights. I sent him for a dental consult with an airway-centered dentist, colleague of mine. And she figured out pretty quickly that, yeah, he wasn't breathing very well, which meant he wasn't sleeping very well, which meant he wasn't acting very well. And then also his tongue didn't have space to do what it was supposed to do. So she did some palate expansion. And she also wanted him to wear this oral device, which is kind of like a mouth guard, to help the tongue rest properly, to help expansion. It didn't work for the family. It was too hard. The palate expansion was fine because it was anchored in. But this is a device that you have to put in. And it was too hard. And so in the interest of like, sometimes we forget, and we really have to remember as practitioners, especially, that like everybody's coming with a different bandwidth for intervention.
Right.
Everybody's coming with a different tolerance for what they can handle in their life right now. And the last thing we want to do is have the cure be worse than the problem that we're trying to solve. And so for this particular family, it really didn't work. They got benefit. They got some benefit. So all that to say, like, there's a big rabbit hole to go down, and you got to meet people where they are.
Yeah. And actually, this is an area where I could really spin out for a long time, because in public health, and especially in public health nutrition, which is where I spend a lot of my time and energy thinking and trying to solve big problems, you do run into what is someone else's capacity to do what I have found in my own life is necessary to feed my family well. Setting aside the gigantic topic of economic issues that would prevent someone from being able to afford adequate, robustly nutritious food in today's economy, I always say this, like, I have worked as a chef professionally. I have worked as a personal chef in other people's homes.
Mhm.
And I still feel a little overwhelmed when I open a CSA box. Like, access is only part
Yeah.
-1 of the food conversation.
Mhm.
And food is so critical to everything else, just like breathing and sleep. But if you say to a family, oh, I see you have a lot of chronic illness in your family and you're having food access issues, we're going to solve that for you and send you basically a CSA box of produce every week. Unless you are also sending them a personal chef to cook that food,
Mhm.
have you actually solved a problem for them? And I think this is going to be a big topic soon because we are thankfully moving towards this conversation of produce prescriptions. And there is data showing that sending someone fresh produce does benefit them. But what are all the other things? So in this kid's case, he came to you. He got good care. He got a great referral. And by the way, there were about 100 places in that step where he could have fallen through the cracks,
Mhm.
right? Plenty of kids get referred for things. They never make it to the appointment.
Mhm.
Or they don't even get to the first practitioner.
Yeah.
Or their parents can't get time off from work to take them. Or the nanny doesn't like to do doctor's visits, whatever it is.
Yep.
So this kid already was lucky, privileged enough to get here and then here and then here.
Mhm.
And then you find that pinch point for that family, like
Yep.
you're saying. But there are a million pinch points for every different family.
Yeah.
And so on a public health level, access is important. But then to make it sustainable, what are the tools, not just the education, but the resources and the infrastructure that need to be put into place? Because without that, you can have the best science and the best data, the best advancements, and it won't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Or it has the potential to hit a brick wall.
Yep.
And then what do?
Yeah. You're also dealing with kind of meeting people where they are in terms of their willingness to accept new information. You're dealing with yourself as a practitioner needing to know a lot of stuff that's kind of outside the scope of what I'm actually going to be working on with a family. And yeah, sometimes I'm going to be dealing with like oral myofunctional stuff. And there are many, many specialists who do that. But I find that when we have to know a lot of things in order to ask the right questions of the families that we're serving, and then kind of work with them at the level they are at. And so, right, this is never a one size fits all. And I hear you in terms of like, okay, what's the like minimum baseline here that we can implement successfully? One of the things that we say often in the speech language therapy world is like generalization is really important. So like it's fine for me to sit at a table and work with you on dogness, but now I need you to go into the world and like
Right.
spot all the dogs you can. If we as clinicians are giving parents and families homework assignments that are unmanageable,
Right.
that's unacceptable. We can't do that. We cannot overwhelm families, and parents of young kids are overwhelmed enough. So like everything gets thrown into the hopper, and again, it gets complicated very quickly.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've always gravitated towards, and there could be a lot of reasons for this. We don't have time to unpack my entire psychology, but I think for many reasons, I have gravitated towards solutions that require removing things as opposed to adding things. When I look at all the modifications that I've made to my life or what I'm inclined to do if I'm feeling overwhelmed, it's always to take away, right? Oh, I'm like super stressed out. I'm going to be on my screen less. I'm not feeling my best. I'm going to cut out some of these foods for a while. I'm not really someone that gravitates towards adding in different therapies, different tools, different devices. And I think part of that is because, I was a teen mom, I've been busy, and that overwhelm that hits me, like, I don't want to add anything. I just want to make it simpler. And I think that that's important to look at when we're talking to clients and policymakers. Like, are we over-engineering in a way that's going to overwhelm people and cause them to shut down? I also wanted to point back to this thing that you were saying earlier, which I think, not that it was missed, but I don't want to not emphasize it, that little kids want to survive. They are little baby animals, and the human animal is a survival machine. And so they are hardwired to please you, to satisfy your demands, to align themselves with you so that you will feed them, wipe them, protect them, help them get to bed, because they want to survive. They don't know they're doing that. But I think that oftentimes in our culture, we are very quick to point to something and call it dysfunction, when actually it's function responding to a dysfunctional world.
Yeah.
So a kid's acting out and we go, that's a behavioral issue. But the issue is that mom and dad work late every night and kid never gets to bed till 10. Guilty, speaking from personal experience. Anytime that I'm like, I don't think my daughter's behavior is so, oh, right, I pushed bedtime an hour late every night last week because I was on a deadline. That's not her. She's just trying to survive. I'm the asshole.
Yep.
But I think that this happens over and over and over. We look at a child's behavior or their health or something else and we go, that's dysfunctional. But if we were to break it down a different way, could we find function, a functional response, a logical response to a dysfunctional world?
I say this to parents all the time. There's a really good reason why your child is doing this, why your child has this. We just don't know what it is yet.
Right.
There's a really good reason for this. I think this came up in your interview with Dr. Miles. And if people haven't listened to it, they should. I'll plug it so you don't have to.
I agree. I've heard good things.
Yeah. But it's, I agree with you. I think it is, maybe it's, I've heard this term too, is like maladaptive. I don't think it's maladaptive.
Yeah,
I think
just
it's adaptive.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, we can have adaptations that are desirable or less desirable. But like, fact is, yeah, this works, right? Melting down on the floor of the kitchen when I'm overtired spurs somebody to put me to bed.
Right.
That works.
Right.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
Right. And that worked last week and maybe it'll work again today.
Right.
Right. Kids are, I always say this, kids are little scientists. They are constantly testing their environment for what is going to work. And it starts when they are babies, like fresh out, right? They cry. Does somebody come and get me? Do I need to cry more? Right? Anybody who's had a child knows that like the 15 stages of escalation, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a survival instinct. That is not, and even in a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old, that is survival. That is not, I'm here to make your life miserable.
Right.
And I think we come with this assumption often that like they should just do what we say and they should listen to what we say because we have their best interests in mind and sit down and be quiet.
Right. And I mean, frankly, I think that is trained in us as children, and I don't think it ever goes away as adults. I had a very unique experience of being robbed at gunpoint when I was 18. And tell you what happened. Car pulls over, they pull a gun on me and my friends. Here I am. It's a survival situation. I flirted with the gunman until he left. I did not consciously. I wasn't like, he's cute. My body, a woman's body raised in American society in the 90s and 2000s, knew that my best chance to survive when a man was being scary was to sexualize myself and to be really nice. I was laughing. I was joking with him. I was offering him my jewelry. I was like, you like these? He eventually packed up and left.
Yeah.
I'm alive.
Yeah.
And I flirted as a survival mechanism.
Yeah.
I think that is obviously maladaptive and adaptive.
Yeah.
It's weird that my neurological systems, social behavioral systems, have been trained to flirt my way out of danger. But here I am, a woman in America.
Yeah.
And the globe. And it worked. I don't recommend it as a method. I am not offering training classes on this. This is not a how-to get out of a gun situation, but there it is.
Yeah. And listen, that I don't even know if that came from your socialization per se, because I wonder about kind of, your biologicals in that moment of like powerful male figure, female figure. Like I do actually have questions about that in terms of like, if we're going to bring it back down to childhood.
Yeah.
Because I'm a little amped up right now. There are any number of stress responses. Well, there's a few stress pathways, right? So one is, I always get them confused.
HPA.
Dorsal. They're going to be freeze.
Yeah.
Or fight.
Right. Fawn,
which is what you were doing,
yeah.
right? Flirt, the other F too, by the way. Or
fight,
freeze,
flight, freeze, fawn.
Yeah, fight, flight, freeze. And kids they're doing those behaviors automatically.
Right.
There is no thought. They do not want to. Last night I was on a call, on a membership call, and one of the kids, who's 10, bit a classmate. Why did he do this? He did this because the classmate put their hand on his chest and he felt as if he was in danger.
Right.
His lid flipped. Dan Siegel is a pediatrician who's very into neurobiology. It's very cool. Has this image of your lid flipping. So your neurological lid flip, frontal lobe goes offline, survival instinct kicks in. What are you going to do? You're going to protect yourself. He bit the kid.
Mm-hmm.
Did he want to bite the child? No, he was mortified. That bite happened to the biter as well as the bitee.
Right.
And so, and this kind of thing comes up a lot when, particularly with kids with speech and language issues, right, with communication disorders, because they are often hijacked by their brains. And parents want to say, well, why don't they just use their words? If I never hear another person say, use your words, again, I will die.
Oh, no, I've said it.
Happy woman.
I've said it.
Guilty. If they could, they would. Okay? Language is the easiest way. Spoken language is the easiest way to get your thoughts and needs and ideas out into the world. If you could do it, you would do it. If you're not doing it, there's a really good reason. Back to this, like, really good reason.
Right.
And that's where a speech language pathologist comes in. That's where other professionals also come in, is like, let's figure out what the reason is so then we can figure out how to help you.
Right.
And maybe you're not going to be a verbal speaker. Maybe we're going to set you up with a augmentative system that, speaks for you. Or maybe we're going to teach you ASL. So we are going to help you communicate. How are we going to do that?
That's one of the coolest things in the last 30 years of parenting literature is that you can teach infants sign language before they have the faculties to speak.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit sad that my kids are very verbal. So the minute they could start speaking, they threw their sign language away. But I'll never forget regretting teaching my daughter sign language because we were on a long car trip and the whole trip she was signing, all done. All done. And she was so frustrated. She's like, why did you teach me this sign? You are not responding. I am telling you that I am all done. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. Like, this is an 8-hour road trip. It just is what it is. But she was like, but you taught me to say this. But how cool and how much can we unlock in the young mind by seeking these alternative forms of communication? I mean, I love words. I love talking. No one is shocked to hear this. And I fortunately have very verbal kids who also love to verbalize at me, although it doesn't always feel lucky sometimes when I'm working and I'm like, really? Just still talking, huh? But I know where they get it from, so it's totally fine. But there are alternate ways to communicate.
Yeah.
And again, this is maybe a little bit adjacent to what you do, but of course, we are all always communicating with our bodies.
Yes.
Are there things that parents miss in their children when they're only looking for words?
Yeah, lots. And early communication, I mean, like speech and language milestones start at about 3 months. I mean, you can go all the way back to birth, and crying is, vegetative sounds. Baby's burping, they've got gas, baby's crying, baby's pooping, whatever they're doing. But at about 3 months, right? First smile, social smile, right? You smile at them, they smile at you. that is baby's first conversation,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is, I mean, this is a little bit of an artificial format, but when one is in a meeting or talking to another person, right? I say something and then you say something and then I say something. That's a reciprocal interaction, begins when kids are months old.
Right.
When we've got a 2-year-old who's not doing that, for sure the signs are there and they've been missed. Another one is joint attention. So joint attention is an early developmental skill that you need in order to have a conversation with somebody. Joint attention means we're paying attention to the same thing that's outside of ourselves. So we see a dog on the street and I point at the dog and you look at the dog and I look at the dog and then we look at each other because we both saw a dog. It's amazing, right? That is a developmental milestone that I'm not sure that all parents are aware of. And again, like, all parents don't have to be child development specialists,
Right.
except that in today's world where like many, many things are going sideways in childhood because we have this wonky environment that kids are being born into, it does help a lot.
Right. So how do we, we've talked a bit about how many things that are called dysfunction are actually sort of a biological function that's doing its best in a crazy world. But I don't want to miss the topic of things that are, I don't know if dysfunctional is the word, but lacking the ability to function fully or optimally due to certain basic inputs missing. So the basic human immune system depends on nutrients. Those nutrients are found in food. We are actually wired to seek those nutrients with smell and sight and touch and taste. So any disruption to your senses can impact your ability to adequately seek nutrients through consumption of food. And then the human organism is an animal, and we're dirty, and we're supposed to be dirty, and we have this bidirectional relationship with our environments, and we are supposed to be full of bacteria and fungi and viruses. It's a messy world in there. But in that messy world, a lot is created and transformed. So we eat foods, and there are many nutrients in those foods that we can't actually break down and digest, but the microbes in us can. And there are actual neurotransmitters that are produced by the microbes in our gut. And yet a whole body of literature that, if you've heard the podcast before, you've heard me talk about, studying the microbiome, is showing that over the last, let's say 50 years, dramatic changes have occurred to the human microbiome, also to our environmental microbiomes, to animal microbiomes, but for the purposes of this discussion, the human gut. And that can start during potentially pregnancy. There's some hot debates over the role that the mother's microbiome is playing during pregnancy, but more and more I think that the literature does point to some communication happening pre-birth from the mother's gut microbiome to the fetus. Certainly her nutrient status is impacting her available nutrients for neurological development of the fetus and for supplying her placenta with adequate nutrients for the fetus. But then the birth process, right? We've moved away in many cases. We have higher rates of cesarean births for a variety of reasons. Some of them life-saving and others more economic. I'll put that gently. And then we have different kinds of foods introduced to children at a young age. Babies aren't crawling out to the garden to eat a dirty carrot. They're getting things in pouches, in plastic.
Don't get me started on pouches.
Endocrine disruptors galore, And, I've been the mom that goes to Costco and gets the 30-pack of, like, the baby snack because, like, I'm a working mama and you got to make it happen. But all of these things have a profound impact on the gut microbiome. And the gut microbiome has a critical, essential, and profound impact on neurological development. And indeed, many of these things, like you mentioned, that we discuss very commonly as behavioral, are now more so being unveiled as neurological and behavioral. There's a bidirectional thing there. You can behavior someone into neurological changes, and you can neurologically shift someone into behavioral changes. So it's not one or the other.
Yep.
And we don't ever, pretty much every single topic that I care about, it's like, well, it's both. Sorry, you wanted a simple answer. I don't have one for you. It's always both. But I am curious now. So you were just saying not every parent needs to be a child development expert.
Mhm.
But it'd be nice.
But it would be nice.
And similarly, not every speech language pathologist needs to be a microbiome and nutrition expert, but it would be nice.
It would be really nice.
And how should we maybe, I don't know if you want to give a should or a could or a might, but where do you see this going? Where do you think it is now in terms of people in this field starting to understand, if my kid with the speech delay also has tummy troubles, maybe we're missing a microbiome piece.
Yeah.
Or if my kid with, somewhere on the autism spectrum only wants to eat 2 foods and so is chronically deficient in these 4 key nutrients that help with the functioning of the neurological system, maybe there's something that we're missing there. Where is it now?
Mhm.
Where do you think it could go? And where do you hope it goes?
Okay, so where it is now, when I was in graduate school, it was very much like stay in your lane, you treat, and in some speech pathology programs, like you basically only treat from the chest or neck up. Now that is, are we allowed to swear?
Yes.
That is some horse shit. Because you cannot speak without air. Speech is generated by airflow flowing through the vocal folds.
Yeah, tell singers that you only do speech from the neck up.
Correct. So already we've got torso involved. Now we got to look at the rest of the body, because if, extremities are weak or we don't have good positioning, then we also don't have good speech. So speech is kind of the ultimate fine motor activity. So a kid who has handwriting difficulties probably is doing something wonky with their mouths. Either they're a very selective eater, maybe they have some kind of speech articulation issue, maybe more. Who knows? So the whole body is involved. And the whole sensory system is involved. I once had a child who could not say the sound Why? Because he could not tolerate the feeling of his lips touching.
The vibration.
Yeah. And so, again, like as a speech language pathologist, I'm like, you have to say the sound in order to be understood. But also, as a speech language pathologist, I need to be curious about this kid's sensory system so that I can figure out why he's not doing it. Because no amount of like, say is going to help him do that. Like, I got to circumvent his sort of cognitive system and go deeper. And I think where we are right now, generally as a field, is we're looking at the macro systems. We're looking at behavior. We're looking at what we can see on the surface. And what I want is for people to understand that what we see on the surface is a direct reflection of what's happening at a cellular level, right? So the macro, so the micro. So if your kid is screaming at you, that's because his mitochondria are also screaming, right? And organs and brain. So like, I think that's where I want people to understand. And then what to do about it. Like, I'm about to probably go get some kind of nutrition certification. Who knows? You and I will be talking a lot more. But then it becomes about kind of how much bandwidth do you have as a clinician. But at least to understand that so that you can refer. Right? So then, nutritionist or some kind of dietitian should be on everybody's speed dial. For the kids that they work with, particularly if they're in pediatric. GI, yes. ENT, yes. Airway-centered dentist, yes. Myofunctional specialist, yes. So, but again, like, even as I'm saying it, I'm like, oh, I'm overwhelmed too. Right. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And again, not everybody has to do everything. I do think a basic level of awareness is where it starts.
So there's 2 things that came up for me in response to that. The first is this thing I'm always saying, which is zoom in, zoom out.
Yeah.
Zoom into the microscope, zoom out to the universe. It's all the same.
Yes.
And you have to know when and how to toggle back and forth and pick the lens that you're going to examine a problem from. And this morning I was saying to my mom, if you zoom out too far, you just go, shit's fucked. And that's true. At a macro level, shit is fucked. But can you solve a problem from that far of a distance? I can't. if you say to me, man, the whole world is so messed up. Yeah, I agree, but I can't do anything about the whole world is messed up. So that means I got to zoom in a little bit. If you get all the way to the mitochondrial level, you're going to lose a lot of people. They're going to be like, I don't know what that means, right? So where between mitochondria and the universe can we solve problems? And in response to that, I think of that quote, don't ask what the world needs, but ask what makes you come alive, because the world needs people that have come alive. And I think that's the answer for on what level we solve problems. Because, yeah, some people are, like, I have a friend who's a chef, professional chef, and she recently got diagnosed with gluten sensitivity.
Mm.
Now, I haven't had gluten in 20 years, and I've done a lot of things in response to that. But she immediately is like, I want to open a gluten-free culinary academy. And I'm like, holy crap, that's so cool, right?
Yeah.
That wouldn't have occurred to me, because where I want to solve problems is not founding an inclusive culinary academy. But of course, there's a need for that. Of course, society needs that. All the way out where shit's fucked, you need a gluten-free culinary academy for these up-and-coming celiac chefs.
Yeah.
She's the man for the job, right? And then I think that, and you were just touching on this, like referral partners is so important at the more zoomed in level, because if you're going to get to a place, like, so much about the mouth and the body and speech and like, what is a cup and what is a dog and what does it mean to say cup or dog, and who are we to even take these sounds, these phonemes, and swoosh them together, and where do they divide? To know enough about that, you may never know enough about running a gluten-free culinary academy or a hospital or whatever it is that society also needs. And so for all of us, it's like, for those of us who want to fix big problems, and there's an unlimited amount of big problems, so choose your problem. But we really have to figure out like where we can do our best work because of some combination of, you love to communicate, so you're working on the communication piece. And then also, like, how do we assemble this team? And I think, again, you and I are here today because someone in our lives who loves us and wants us to be happy sensed that we share a mission and we hold different pieces of the puzzle, so to speak.
Yep.
And it's so important. It's so important. Now, I'm curious. You had this aha moment with the speech pathology practitioner. But what about on a personal level? Like, is there a personal tie-in for you in terms of like why this work means so much? Like, not like you ended up shadowing a 4-year-old kid with autism. Like, that didn't happen out of nowhere, right? Like, how did you find this work?
Okay. You're going to make me cry, which is so funny.
You made me cry before the cameras were even rolling, so fair's fair.
So the thing that I do, which is a little bit magical and a little bit mystical to me, is I have the ability to connect with pre-verbal, non-speaking children. And so that is the thing that lights me up. Give me a frustrated 2-year-old who is just like, I know you want something from me, but I cannot give it to you right now. That is the person I want to spend a lot of time with. And so I even forgot what the question was, because as you were talking, I was like, that's my person. And I was like imagining myself there. But there is this level of attunement that I am able to achieve particularly with littles. And then to show parents how to achieve that level of attunement. When you have attunement, you have everything you need. Woo! Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's true in all relationships, but I find that it's the most important in early childhood.
Yeah.
And yeah, that is like that's my why.
Yeah. I get that. I also feel like my why is babies. Like every single baby, I say this all the time. I'm like, give me any baby on the planet if they need me. My religion is babies. Who is my God? Babies. There is nothing I wouldn't do for a baby. I would stand up all night, standing and bouncing up and down. I've done it. Baby needs it. Baby gets it. Yeah. There's something about a baby and how, without words, it is their entire job to tell you what they need. And knowing how hard that must be. and just wanting to do my best by them.
And it's a willingness, I was thinking about this last night actually. It's a willingness to remove yourself from like to remove any barriers to that being possible for that baby, right? You and I are the same in this way. Like I cannot go to a restaurant without flirting with the toddler. And my family knows if there's a toddler in the restaurant,
It's
we're
over.
done.
Yeah.
We're not having a conversation. And I will quiz the family about, birth history and like, how's it going? And like, how many words do they have and all that. And then flirt with the toddler the whole time. But like removing, I think that's what I love about it is like, I don't have any of the mishigas that comes into my own head about life in general and how big the problems are and all of that. All that goes away when I'm in the presence of a small person because all I have is them and they are filled with like joy and possibility and ambition and delight. And, they haven't developed any coping strategies to handle the world. Any sort of strategies on purpose anyway. Right.
They have a few hardwired in there.
They have some hardwired.
And, that's why for many years I worked more at the personal and individual level, obviously as a mother, as a restaurant owner, as a health coach. And I reached this point where I felt like if I'm not doing things at a policy level, then certain populations will never even have the chance to try the kind of things that I'm suggesting. Because even though I was sort of being negative on quote unquote access earlier, if you don't have access, you have nothing.
Yeah.
You have to at least enable access. It's not enough. It's not enough at all. Access can be overwhelming. Access can feel like there's too much on my plate. Access can feel like I have too many choices. How do I pick one? So it's not enough, but it is essential. And so to me, I know that the one-to-one work will always be critical. Behavior change, healing, that needs a personalized touch. You're never going to find two kids that are exactly the same. They might struggle with similar things. They might both be humans, but they're not exactly the same.
Yeah.
But on a policy level, basic access to clean air and water, basic access to nutrient-dense food, a basic understanding in the healthcare system of the role that nutrition plays in health and a role that developmental neurological changes play in long-term health and that oxygenation of the cells plays in behavior, a basic understanding in the public school system of what behavioral differences might signal in children in terms of underlying conditions, deficiencies, troubles. All of these things can be addressed at a policy level through education, through access initiatives, through changes to the healthcare system, through allocation of funding for research. And it'll never be enough. You need the boots on the ground. Someone has to hold the baby.
Yeah.
If the baby's in the crib and you're on PubMed figuring out all the literature that is going to help you understand their gut, which I've also done that, that's great. And it's amazing that there are scientists out there producing that literature because I've seen up close. It's many sleepless nights. And I just very ironically was writing a report on women's mental health, and I'm up until 1 o'clock in the morning. And I'm ignoring my kids during the day, and it's a report on women's mental health. And the report is like, essential is connection and family relationships and sleep. And I'm like, yes,
Damn
it
that.
is. Indeed it is. But your working mom's got to do what they got to do.
Yeah.
But somebody has to hold the baby. And somebody has to show the toddler, this is a glass. And somebody has to be in the moment.
Yeah.
So every level of change is needed, right? It can't just be like, where's the best place to solve problems at a policy level? Where's the best place to solve them? Right there with the person holding their hand. You need both, always.
It's not another both and, Marian.
It's a both and. Yes, it's a both and I will not apologize. It's both. It's like, which is more important, eating a nutrient-rich diet or getting the right microbes into your mouth? The microbes will die if you don't eat the diet. The diet won't metabolize adequately if you don't have the microbes. Healthy foods aren't necessarily healthy if they reach a gut that has no bacteria in there. And bacteria will go into the mouth and will eat the lining of your intestines, making you more vulnerable to autoimmune disease if they don't have fiber to eat. It's always both.
Yeah.
This is my broad advice. Stop trying to make it one or the other. It's always both.
Yep.
We're so knee-jerk. We're so like, it's got to be black and white. It's not. It's not.
Yeah.
And of course, this applies to speech and it applies to everything. I think it's time to bring it home. I think it's time to send this conversation into the history books,
Let's do it.
into the internet. What do you hope for in the future of your work? You
Mhm.
have some work that you're doing outside of speech language, some work with sensitive kiddos of all types. You have a podcast, you have coaching, you have group classes. Where has your unique gift and attunement and skill set and passion for communication, which is on many levels, linguistic, emotional, societal, where does all of this lead, and what is the next step in terms of putting all this together in your current work and your future work? Where are you going with this, and where can people find you and connect with you and be as lucky to speak with you as I have been?
So the podcast is called the Complicated Kids Podcast. They can absolutely check that out wherever they are listening to this podcast. My pediatric private practice, which is in Washington, D.C., is called Speech Kids, speechkids.com. And the parent coaching and education practice is called raisingorchidkids.com. We didn't even get into orchids. That's a different conversation. And I think if you're asking me where it's going, I think this parent education and clinician education of micro, macro, zoom in, zoom out, and kind of, accounting for all of the variables that affect people's nervous systems, which is what's driving their behavior. And really understanding behavior through that lens is like what I'm really passionate about.
I love that.
Yeah.
And that thing you just said about the micro and the macro, I'm thinking, it's like with a workout, if you're getting tired of upper body, you switch to lower body. If you're working with a family or you're working on a problem and you tire of the mega zoom in, zoom out. I think I spent years so zoomed in that I had to zoom out. And then, you've spent so many years zoomed in and you're zooming out. But I think for everyone, I just want to sort of call to action in terms of anyone feeling overwhelmed with a health challenge or a societal challenge, and they're related. If you've been zoomed in, try zooming out. And if you've been zoomed out, try zooming way in. Just switch the frame, because I think that we can increase our capacity if we mix it up a little bit.
That is good advice, I would say.
Awesome. Well, Gabrielle, I am so grateful that you came here today, because as we both know, we could chat for hours on end. We've done it.
And
in
have.
fact. We will do it again. But this conversation, I really hope, reaches parents, babies, to all the babies out there. Goo goo. And thank you for listening. We both love you so much. But I do hope that you will come back sometime. And I hope that maybe next time we're talking about some work that we're doing together.
That is, yes, I accept.
Capitol Hill, watch out.
Here we go.
Thank you once again for listening to the Marian Flaxman Network Podcast, a podcast dedicated to reintroducing personal narratives into critical public health topics. For more information on me, Marian, please visit my website at marianflaxman.com. For more information on my guest, Gabriele Nicolet, and to find her podcast, the Complicated Kids Podcast, please find the links in the show notes. This episode was produced by Brain Trust Productions and sponsored by Informed Solutions Consulting. Thank you so much once again for listening, and we will see you next time.